Global oil markets are changing dramatically. Electric vehicles are gaining traction. The pressure to decarbonize is also rising, while tight oil is changing the very behavior of markets. Here to discuss, BP's Group Chief Economist Spencer Dale. I just want to start with this low carbon future everyone talks about. We're essentially talking, Spencer, about decarbonizing a carbon industry, aren't we?
Well, we're talking about decarbonising the world, and the world of energy for the last 50, 100 years has been very dominated by energy, fossil fuel energy, which generates carbon emissions. And so trying to find solutions to that is key, I think, yes.
Now, many would argue that oil and gas will not play a big role in this sort of new carbon, well, less carbon economy. What would you say to that?
A central message from this year's BP's Energy Outlook, which looks ahead of the trends over the next 20 years, is that the global energy system faces a dual challenge, so twin challenges: the need for more energy as well as less carbon. Now, less carbon, I think most people understand and recognise. Climate science is real. There's a need to get carbon emissions to fall very substantially. And so far, the world is on a path where, if anything, carbon emissions are likely to continue to rise. So we need to do far more in terms of decarbonising the energy system. But the world, at the same time, the world also needs more energy. In the scenarios we look at in the Energy Outlook, global energy rises somewhere between 20 and 30%. All of that growth comes from the developing world. Rich, developed countries like here in the UK or America, we have more than enough energy. All of that growth in energy demand is coming from developing countries as people move out of low incomes and start to enjoy some of the fraction of the benefits that we can have. And so the sort of the system, the challenge we face is to carry on producing the energy the world needs to grow and prosper, as well as decarbonising the energy system. And to do that, we are likely to need many energies for many years. Renewables will play an absolute key role here, growing quicker, I think, than any fuel we've ever seen in history. But on its own, renewables are not going to be able to provide the world the power and energy the world needs to continue to grow and prosper. So we will need other energies as well.
So a flexible mix, really, of energy as we transition to this new era.
Yes, and so we are transitioning to a lower carbon energy system, and so a big part of that is renewables. But remember, a key thing here is it's not a race to renewables, it's a race to reduce carbon emissions. And there are many other things other than just renewables to help do that. A key part there is energy efficiency. If we can just use energy more efficiently, that will help significantly. Secondly, if we can reduce the use of coal and replace coal, for example, with natural gas, that will also help very substantially. Every time we produce an electron using natural gas rather than coal, the carbon emissions roughly halves. So switching away from coal into natural gas helps. You can also use natural gas within the power sector using what we call carbon capture and storage. So you capture the carbon and you sequester it under the ground. So many technologies and many fuels are likely to play a role if we're going to succeed in that sort of road to achieving the Paris climate goals.
Now, we just had a Twitter question come through as well from one of the people watching right now. It's a complex trade-off. What policy frameworks and regulations are required to cut CO2 emissions and grow the global economy is the question.
Yeah, so I think the simplest and perhaps sort of number one policy, which I think most experts would agree on, but we don't see very much today, is you put a price on carbon. You have a meaningful carbon price. That can be done via carbon tax in some countries. In other countries, it can be done via sort of a cap and trade system, which is what we have here in Europe. How you achieve that carbon price, in some sense, I think doesn't matter so much as long as we have a meaningful price on carbon. And the reason why putting a price on carbon is so important is if you want to reduce something, if you want to ration something, the best way of doing that is you put a price on it. And that then provides incentives for everybody to play their role.
You commoditize it.
Yes, and so consumers have an incentive to switch. Producers like BP have an incentive to produce more cleaner carbon fuels. Inventors have an incentive to invest in other types of new inventions which help to reduce carbon emissions. So a price on carbon, a carbon price, I think is critical if we're to achieve that sort of rapid transition to a lower carbon world.
And this is coming off the same person that tweeted the earlier questions. What other incentives do you think are out there other than commoditizing carbon?
So I think what we have seen with renewables was a whole variety of support provided by government to help take those fledgling technologies and allow them to grow and expand. And that makes perfect economic sense. So I think what we have seen with wind and solar power has been a great example of that. Surprisingly, we're not seeing that same sort of support for things like carbon capture, use and storage, which is another key technology that we will need to use. So I think finding technologies which you think are going to play an important role in that road to Paris and making sure we have the right incentives for those technologies to scale and for private companies to invest in them, I think is key.
How safe is carbon capture? Many critics say the problem is you can't guarantee it's never going to release the carbon.
I think most experts now would recognise that carbon capture, use and storage is an established technology. It works. The problem is, in what economists would call, is a public good. So it's like streetlights or roads. Everybody benefits from streetlights, everybody benefits from roads. As a result of which you can't just rely on private companies to produce streetlights and roads because they won't produce enough of them. And that's what we're seeing with carbon capture, use and storage. At the moment, the incentives aren't there. There isn't a meaningful carbon price. And so we're not getting the investment in carbon capture and storage like we need to see.
Okay, you talked about, this mix of energy sources. Going back to that, what happens after this phase? What happens 20, 30, 40 years from now, Spencer? Are we going to see a fundamental shift in big oil and the structure of the industry?
So you're absolutely right. There's in our energy outlook, we have a scenario called a rapid transition scenario. And that's a scenario which is this is what we need to do to stand a good chance of achieving Paris. And in that scenario, you reduce carbon emissions very roughly by about half by 2040. So that's a good step on the way to Paris, but you're only halfway there. If we're going to go to a net zero world, we need to get rid of the other half as well. And so then, if you like, the carbon emissions which are still remaining at 2040 are the hard to abate emissions. They're the ones which are far harder to get at. How do you decarbonise the aviation sector? We're not going to have planes going across the Atlantic powered by electricity. That's just not feasible. High temperature heat processes within the industry, again, hard things to abate. And so you'll need different types of technology. Decarbonised power sector is key, but also I think we'll need a role for hydrogen. We also will need a role for more biofuels. The easiest way of thinking about decarbonising the airline industry is to use biofuels, so other types of liquid fuels which don't give off those carbon emissions. For a company like BP, I think what we will need to do and evolve over time is we will need to evolve from being an oil and gas company to increasingly being an energy company. And I think that will be a challenging transition. But if you can make that transition, the future's pretty bright. The one thing I'm pretty certain of over the next 20 years is the world needs more energy. I can think of many other industries in the world today where I'm nowhere near confident with the growth of artificial intelligence, blockchain and so on, that the world will need more banking services or more business services, more high street services. We know the world will need more energy. And so if a company like BP can shift from being an oil and gas company to being an energy company, then the future's pretty bright.
So oil to energy, does the structure of BP need to change as well? I mean, it used to be an engineering type company. How will this structure change as we go forward?
Yes, it will need to change. I think it will need to change in terms of the products that we produce. So in the scenarios we look at, there will be a significant role for oil and gas for the next couple of decades. Remember, many energies for many years. There may well be a long-run permanent role for natural gas if combined with carbon capture and storage, either in the power sector or generating hydrogen. But we will need to invest more in renewable energy. BP is already one of the world's largest, across the super majors, has one of the largest operated renewable businesses with biofuels in Brazil, onshore wind business in the US. We recently teamed up with Lightsource, which was Europe's largest solar developer, and over the last year it's now Lightsource BP, and that is developing solar projects around the world. So we will evolve and change over time, and the key thing is we have to be smart here, and we have to be smart in two respects. One is exactly the nature and speed of this energy transition is very difficult to predict. So making big bets now and say, oh, BP will look like this in 20 years' time or that in 30 years' time, we don't know. Okay, so number one is we will need to be agile and flexible in the way we do this. And secondly, we will need to operate in this space in a way where we have a comparative advantage. Go back 10 or 15 years, BP used to be one of the world's largest manufacturers of solar PV panels. Guess what? We have no comparative advantage in making solar PV panels. And so when the Chinese started doing mass production of solar PV panels, we lost a lot of money. Now we are doing a far smarter thing in terms of the way we do solar development, and we're not building the panels, we buy those panels in, and the value that we bring working with Lightsource, in Lightsource BP, is developing solar projects and then often finding investors who will then invest in those solar projects once they're up and running, and you have long-term purchase agreements with governments or large corporations.
So it sounds like you're effectively becoming a manufacturer. Managing these sources of energy. Is that right?
I think, if you like, the analogy of the energy business moving from an engineering business to a manufacturing business, I think it is quite an apt one. And you can see that in oil and gas. You could go back 20 years in oil and gas. That was predominantly an engineering business. There was a shortage of oil, or a perceived shortage of oil. Each project tended to be a bespoke engineering project, as you put a drilling platform in the middle of the ocean somewhere, and each one was designed to maximise the recovery from that reservoir. We're not ever going to run out of oil. The world's awash with oil. We're moving to a world of far greater standardisation, where now the language of upstream oil is to do with standardisation, efficiency, productivity, margins. These are all words which were pretty not familiar vocabulary 20 years ago, but they are the vocabulary of manufacturing. And so we move from engineering to lean manufacturing. And I think that certainly is a sort of key theme within BP, but I think it's pretty much a key theme across much of the majors at the moment.
Now, we've also got a Twitter question on technologies and how oil companies are evolving. This one is about open hardware science, network, kite turbine, wind energies. Could this be scaled to provide massive amounts of cheap energy? And would BP pursue R&D in this space? I mean, this is essentially about future technologies, isn't it? Do you think enough is being spent on future technologies away from the wind, tidal?
Yeah, so I think massive investment is going into renewable energy, wind and solar. That's resulting in costs coming down. So there's what's known in the industry as this sort of learning curve within solar energy. So each time solar energy capacity doubles, solar costs tend to come down by about 20% or so. And given the pace at which this is doubling, that leads to very substantial falls in costs. That only comes about through technology. But it's not just in the new energies where this is happening. Digitalization is completely transforming the nature of oil and gas production today. And this sometimes can seem a bit abstract, really. Last summer I was fortunate. I went out to the North Sea in one of the platforms in the North Sea. It was 8 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, and I was sitting in a control room, and they were getting real-time feeds from a project which essentially was a big data project, looking at the performance of all our reservoirs across time, over time across all our reservoirs, and using that big data to help these people manage in real time that control of that reservoir 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night in the middle of the North Sea. This is just not what this is completely changed from 10, 15 years ago. And so when you hear about companies saying digitalization, big data, and it all sounds abstract, trust me, Wednesday, 8 o'clock, middle of the North Sea, and it's happening in real time. This is really changing things.
So what would you say to someone who is young, ambitious, coming into the workforce? Why would they join an oil major when there's Silicon Valley, when there are tech companies out there, presumably with, big, fat salaries?
So I think there's three reasons. One is you'll be busy. Under all the scenarios that I have seen, the world needs significant amounts of oil and gas over the next 20 or 30 years. To achieve that, given the natural decline, we will need trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of investment in new oil and new gas. So that's one. Secondly, you'll be working increasingly in what feels to me right at the cutting edge of a big tech energy business. For many people, what they're doing now today feels more, I think, working in a tech business than it does in terms of a traditional oil or energy business. So if you want to be at the cutting edge of new technologies, it's the scale of what we do in these super majors is enormous, and the amount of money and investment you can do on that big majors. Third is you're doing good to the world. Now, I understand people may say, really? You're producing oil and gas. Remember, all of the growth in energy over the next 20 years is being driven by the developing world as people live out of low incomes. Today, over 2.5 billion people don't have access to clean cooking facilities. That means every time they cook their family meal at night, they're killing and poisoning their families. Yes, we will need growth in oil and gas, in renewables, but that won't do it. Okay, and so if we don't have this investment, continuing investment in oil and gas, those 2.7 billion people will carry on poisoning their families. So you'll be busy, you'll be at the cutting edge of new technology, and you'll be doing good for the world.
What would you say, though, Spencer, to those people who bring up single-use plastics? Yes, you can say, glass is a good alternative. Plastic is not recyclable. This is the key issue. It is, but it's very, very difficult. A lot of these single-use plastics go in the sea, and obviously we've had really bad press surrounding them. Every time there's a picture of a whale. What would you say to those people who want single-use plastics banned?
So I can really understand that issue. I think the environmental concerns associated with plastics are very significant. Key point number one is it's not all plastics. Many things around this studio, from the chairs, from the equipment around us, will be in long-lived, durable plastics. That's not the source of environmental concern. The source of environmental concern is those single-use plastics, which is roughly about 1/3 of the plastics produced today. And that's significant for oil demand. So very roughly about 3.5 million barrels a day of oil, we estimate, are used in producing plastics today. And that could go up to about 6 million barrels a day by 2040. So significant. And so suppose...
That's a very big number.
Yeah, it is a big number. It's a big number, but you remember oil demand today is nearly 100 million barrels a day, and it's going to carry on growing. So it's 6 out of 100. So suppose you take a very extreme scenario and the world, there was a ban on all single-use plastics by 2040. That could potentially reduce oil demand relative to another world by about 6 million barrels a day. So that's significant, but that's still a world where oil demand is growing, but it's just not growing as rapidly. The one point I would mention is, so to be clear, I understand the concerns associated with plastics. I see the same documentaries as you do. I share your same concerns. My one concern is, before we did start to stop the use of single-use plastics, as a society, we will need to spend more time thinking about what we're going to put in their place. Because it's all right stopping plastic bottles, but what are we going to put in their place? So if you today swap the plastic bottle with a glass bottle, that would take about 80% more energy to produce. That glass bottle would be about 40% heavier, so it would take a lot more energy to transport around the world. Now, if we set up sort of collection and reuse facilities sufficient that glass bottle can be used 4, 5, 6 times or more, then the world's going to be a better place. But you need quite a lot of investment in collection and reuse facilities to make sure that your Heinz tomato ketchup bottle goes to Heinz, your Kraft one goes back to Kraft, and Sainsbury's Own goes back to Sainsbury's Own. So
Spencer, it's easy to quantify, though. We can calculate now how much energy goes into producing the glass bottle and how much oil is being used to deliver and take these bottles back. Surely we can make that sort of comparison.
And so you can make that comparison. So I'm not an expert here. Some of the analysis I've said suggest roughly that you need to use a glass bottle 4 or 5 times for it to offset the extra energy it uses relative to plastics. Now, for milk bottles, so in the UK, we still have milkmen, and they they drop your milk bottles at your doorstep and they collect them the next day. That's fantastic. That they often use 10, 15 times. But how are we going to do that with a tomato ketchup bottle or other types of bottles? To establish that sort of reuse, delivery, and collection and reuse is a difficult thing. So the point here is a bit like whack-a-mole. You push down something one thing and it pops up somewhere else. my answer here is I don't want to be an apologist for plastics. I understand the concerns. All I'm saying is we need holistic policy making. And so when we think our knee-jerk reaction is to try and ban one thing, we just need to say, hold on, what are we going to put in its place? And are we sure the world's going to be a better place as a result of that?
Loving that answer, because we've just got a Twitter question in whilst you were speaking. And this person was listening in and wanted to ask you whether major oil companies are not making enough acquisitions to change the pattern of consumption. Are oil companies becoming the tobacco companies of the 80s?
No, I don't think that analogy is right. I think the world has benefited enormously from oil and gas development over the last 20 or 30 years. As I said, I think the world will carry on developing enormously over the next 20 years from oil and gas. We did some work in the Energy Outlook which looked at the relationship between energy consumption in different countries around the world and human development as measured by the United Nations Human Development Index. And as you would expect, there's a positive correlation between the two. As energy consumption in countries go up, human development tends to go up. Now, you can't say one causes the other, one causes one and one causes the other, and they're all caused by other factors, but they tend to go hand in hand. And that relationship tends to go hand in hand for relatively low levels of energy consumption, up to around 100 gigajoules, which is like one of those really unhelpful statements. But 100 gigajoules is, today in Europe, we consume about 140 gigajoules, America about 280, India about 25. So a little bit less than what we consume in Europe today. 80% of the world's population live in countries where average energy consumption is less than 100 gigajoules. 80% of the world's population live in countries where increases in energy tend to go hand in hand and with the very significant increases in human development. So the world will need to carry on investing in all types of energies. Renewable energy, if you take your most optimistic path, really optimistic path for renewable energy, it may provide around a third of the world's energy in 2040. Assuming we don't want to consume much coal, which is the dirtiest of those fuels, that naturally means something else has to provide the other 2/3, and oil and gas will need to play a key role here. And so, yes, we should push renewables, but we will also need oil and gas as well at the same time for the next couple of decades. And over that period, as I said, companies like BP will gradually evolve from being oil and gas companies to increasingly being energy companies.
Let's quickly move on to electrification. How is this influencing the portfolio strategy of the industry?
I think it's key because when we're thinking about a move to a lower carbon energy system, a sort of step one is you decarbonise the power sector, so you're generating clean energy, and then you try and electrify as many things as you possibly can. And electric cars and electric transportation is like an obvious example of that. In the scenario, in some of our scenarios, which we look at out to 2040, as the world electrifies, we think something like 2/3 or 70% of the increase in primary energy over the next 20 years will go into the power sector. So 2/3 of the growth market in primary energy is going to be absorbed by the power sector. So if you're a company like us, clearly you need a strategy for participating in the power sector if that accounts for 2/3 of your growth of your growth over that period. How you participate, I think, is a difficult thing to know. Remember, we don't know how the world's going to evolve, and so stating now I'm going to do it in this way or that way, I think is harder. But clearly, electrification of the world, the increasing importance of low carbon power, I think are central to that transition to a low carbon energy system, and therefore have to be central to the strategies of companies like BP.
We've got several people listening in from a workshop of young professionals working around renewables. They want to ask you which way is the best way to form a low carbon team and strategy for all sectors?
Wow.
Yes, that's a big question.
That is
for all sectors, not just oil, but all sectors.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that. I mean, in your workshop, you'll be focusing on renewables, and I understand why you're focused on renewables. I guess I am slightly nervous that sometimes when people talk about low carbon, they immediately talk about renewables as if those two things are the only thing in town. I would emphasise very dramatically the importance of energy efficiency. If we can get the world thinking harder about energy efficiency, that could be, all the numbers I've seen, that plays a bigger role in that shift to lower carbon energy system than improving the shifts to renewables. And what's special about energy efficiency, suddenly it's all of our problem. It's not just government's problem or oil producers and gas problems like BP. What are you going to do about it? When are you going to produce more renewables and less oil and gas? Energy efficiency is what all of us are going to do about it. Are we going to take better care in terms of how many times we turn our lights off, or have the air conditioning up a little bit less high, or think about the different cars we drive? Energy efficiency, we can all take control of energy efficiency. And I think increasing social awareness of the importance of energy efficiency, I think will be critical if we're going to go to a low carbon energy system in a rapid way.
Right. And I want to, Spencer, bring in peak oil demand to you. I read your paper on this. I went to Finland before the internet became completely, mainstream. They had, of course, UPM Kamini, a huge paper industry. And before I went, everyone was talking about how the web was going to mean the decline of paper. Lo and behold, it was a boom for this sector. Are we likely to see perhaps a future that no one expected in terms of demand and supply in this space? Are there any unknowns out there, is what I'm asking, for the oil industry?
Yeah, so I think...
I guess one of them is politics, right? Politics has changed energy trade flows quite dramatically in some cases. Are there any known unknowns?
So many different questions there. In terms of, I think politics is important here, and I think that then feeds on to oil demand. In the outlook, in the BP's energy outlook, we sort of consider just how big significant could trade disputes be if they sort of grow and escalate. We've sort of seen a series of trade disputes recently. And so the idea here wasn't to focus on any particular trade dispute, but just to see generically if they became more important. And so typically two things happen in that type of world. One is, if you move to a world with less openness, less trade, almost all economists would agree that the world would grow less quickly in that world, because new ideas in one part of the world are slower to transfer to other parts of the world, because you've got less trade in which those ideas often are transferred around. So the world grows less rapidly, and as a result of which you need less energy demand. But also, and you will see this when you go, when you travel to the Far East just as much as I do, energy security is becoming increasingly an important part of the dialogue. When I see these concerns about various types of trade sanctions or trade disputes, in countries like China, countries like India, they're importing very significant amounts of their oil, significant amounts of the gas, and if you become more concerned about your energy security, you may wish to switch away from importing oil and gas and use greater amounts of domestic resources. So in China, in India, that's often the combination of coal and renewable energy. And so in this scenario where we just assumed a very small sort of increasing concerns about those energy security, we saw, for plausible estimates, you can see the levels of oil and gas imports in China and India grow by 20% less than they otherwise would have done, because essentially at the margin, do you know what, I'll import a few less million barrels a day of oil, and I'll try and use a combination of renewables and coal, and particularly there, into the power sector, and I'll electrify things more rapidly than I was planning to do, just to reduce some of that energy dependence. So I do think there's an interaction between politics and energy security concerns and the impact that would have on oil demand. And one fact which I think from history which reminds us here, which year did the world's share of oil peak? So when was the importance of oil in terms of its share of global energy system peak? It was 1973, the year of the oil embargo. The oil embargo happened. The developed world stood back and went, wow, we are really vulnerable to those types of oil embargoes. Let's diversify our fuel mix. So, for example, in France, you saw the big move towards nuclear energy. The share of oil has never recovered. The importance of oil in the global energy system has declined pretty much ever since. It's never got back to that 1973 peak. The lesson from history is politics, particularly energy security concerns, can have long-run persistent scarring effects, and that's that interaction of oil demand and politics you were talking about.
And just before we go, we've got one more Twitter question that's just come in. A number of emerging economies still very much dependent on traditional energy sources to power their economies. The question is, how do we balance this with the need to cut emissions as we grow? We talked about this earlier. In terms of growth in the future and beyond 2040, what are countries like China, India, Africa going to do?
Yeah, I think this is really important. Let me pick one country. I was there a couple of weeks ago in India. So India is growing very rapidly. It is likely to be the largest growth market for energy demand over the next 20 years, even in terms of growth, even more important than China. They are growing renewable energy, particularly solar, as quickly as they possibly can. But at the same time, the power demand, as they electrify India, will grow very rapidly. That will not all be able to be met by renewable energy, and so they need something else. The cost of coal is an awful lot cheaper than natural gas, and so you'll see coal rising as well under almost any scenario I can see. Now, at this point, some people, particularly in the West, may go, well, this is not very good, is it, Spencer? And you think, well, hold on, these people what is happening here is hundreds and hundreds of millions of people are being lifted out of low incomes where they don't have access to electricity and starting to have access to electricity for the first time. Average levels of energy consumption in India are around 1/10 of the average level of energy consumption by a typical American today. So for them, I think what the Prime Minister of India often talks about, energy justice. So yes, think hard about growing renewables as quickly as possible, but there's an imperative there also to provide more energy to these hundreds of millions of people who can start for their children to be able to do their homework under an electric light bulb. That's something we take for granted. It's a sort of luxury which many billions of people in the world today do not take for luxury.
Right, we have to leave it there. We've run out of time. But just to summarise the key points of our discussion with BP's Group Chief Economist, Spencer Dale, all firms will have to adapt, evolve, invest and shift from an engineering to a manufacturing business. Single-use plastics, yes, there's a global push to decrease its use, but governments need to think really hard as to how to replace it. And also touching on growth in the future for demand. A lot of the developing countries will still need a lot of energy in the future, namely the developing ones, China, India and Africa. My thanks again to BP's Group Chief Economist, Spencer Dale. I'm Angeline Ong for Reuters Plus.